I have returned after a brief illness. So before we get started with today's lecture, I do just want to note that I've been looking at midterm grades for the class, and frankly, they're low, and they're low mostly because people don't seem to be keeping up with the assignments, with the quizzes, or with the discussion boards. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to post new discussion board instructions in Georgia View probably tomorrow morning. That'll be Tuesday the 22nd. I'm hoping that giving you specific prompts in the discussion boards will make it more likely that you will remember to do this part of the work for the class. I'm also going to reopen all of the previous quizzes and give people until the end of next week to complete them. I am also going to reopen the assignment for critique number 2. And those of you who have not completed that, which is most of you, will have a chance to get that done also by the end of next week, right? But then we've really got to get caught up here, y'all, because we are lagging a bit behind. So today I want to talk to you about postcolonial theory. So I asked you to read 3 articles, all of which are considered like classics of postcolonial and area studies criticism. The first, Edward Said's Orientalism from 1977, and Said is kind of like is the figure overshadowing most postcolonial criticism that other critics working in that mode or critiquing that mode have to contend with. His influence is enormous. The media studies scholar Stuart Hall's Cultural Identity and Diaspora from 1989, and Lawrence Venuti's Translation Theory essay, Translation, Empiricism, and Ethics from 2010. So the most recent thing I had you read. So let's talk a little bit first about colonialism as a context for all of this and what exactly post-colonial means. All right, so from about the 16th century onwards, right? You remember, the little nursery rhyme from when you were a kid, probably Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, and then instituted a series of conquests of European, of indigenous peoples by Europeans in the New World. So yeah, from about the 16th century till the early 20th century, European nations are going all around the world, to the Americas, to Africa, to Australia, to South Asia, and just planting flags wherever they can, right? So claiming all of this territory in the name of their nation. By the 19th century, Britain and France are the primary colonial powers. Britain alone controls about 25% of the Earth's surface, and they have the empire on which the quote-unquote sun never sets. So British dominions by the early 20th century include Canada, Ireland, most of the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, and large portions of Africa, with the exception of very small portions of the Indian subcontinent that are controlled by France or by Portugal. And then in the period following the Second World War, most of these former colonies gained their independence in various ways from Britain. By the 1970s, the only there are only a few British colonial possessions left. There's the Falkland Islands off the coast of Argentina. There's Northern Ireland, a couple of other very small places. So to give you some example of the colonialist mindset, I want to tell you a little bit about a guy by the name of Cecil Rhodes, because he's a kind of exemplary figure of the late 19th century British colonialist, right? So Rhodes is a guy who heavily invests in mining operations in South Africa. and becomes very, very wealthy doing so, and has this dream of connecting an electrical grid north to south across Africa, and building railroads all over the continent. Now, this is not out of the goodness of his heart towards the native population of Africa. Rather, he is trying to make it easier for English interests to dominate the continent through travel and communication, right? So here's a well-known quote from Rhodes, who, by the way, is the guy that the Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford is named after, and one of the reasons why people in a lot of students at Oxford in recent years have protested that particular scholarship and asked for it at the very least to be renamed. So Rhodes wrote, "I contend that we, meaning the English, are the finest race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. I contend that every acre added to our territory means the birth of more of the English race who otherwise would not be brought into existence. Added to this, the absorption of the greater portion of the world under our rule simply means the end of all wars. The objects one should work for are first the furtherance of the British Empire, the bringing of the whole uncivilized world under British rule, the recovery of the United States, the making of the Anglo-Saxon race but one empire." So we can get a picture here of what Rhodes's dream looks like, right? So he wants world peace, but he wants world peace through the total global domination of a single world power, right? World peace will come when Britain rules over all, when the English specifically rule over all, like not the Scots, not the Welsh, not the Irish, the English. Now, he also is presenting himself as this kind of benefactor figure to the nations that he refers to as uncivilized, right? Uncivilized basically meaning, from Rhodes's point of view, following ways of life that are different from the British way of life. So the colonialist makes a lot of assumptions about the relative value of his way of life and the ways of life of other peoples across the globe. Now, by the end of the 19th century, colonialism leads to an attitude of almost sort of exhaustion among British writers, officials, and military that is often referred to, in poetry at least, as the white man's burden. So to quote from a famous poem of that title by Rudyard Kipling, himself no stranger to colonialist thoughts and feelings, right? "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child." So there are a couple of competing impulses at work in this poem, right? One is the impulse to make the world, quote unquote, safer and more civilized by making every place more like England. The other half of this, the tension in this comes from the kind of like this bumping up against the fact that the people that the English are going out and conquering don't want to be more like Britain, right? No one has asked them if they want to be more like Britain or not. They've not been consulted. And Kipling and others who buy into the white man's burden trope paint these people as ungrateful, right, for the benefits that British civilization gives them. There's a Monty Python movie that I loved when I was a teenager called The Life of Brian. And one of the scenes that I found funniest then is one that makes me cringe a little bit now, It's, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie, but there's a scene where, the people's front of Judea are arguing in an apartment about, what have the Romans ever done for us? He said, well, medicine, roads, public safety, public health, sanitation, right? And listing all these things that the Romans have brought to them, but that they're still angry that the Romans are there, right? So it's almost kind of almost kind of endorsing that white man's burden attitude, that the Romans have brought you all these great things, just like the English are bringing all these great things to these colonized nations, and why won't they just be grateful for it, right? So by the 1960s, as it's clear that the empire is basically crumbled, and that Britain no longer has the wealth or military might to hold on to its various colonial possessions, this is when we really start to get the idea of the post-colonial, right? Now, when we talk about post-colonial theory, right? Post-colonial is a term that critics, historians, and sociologists often use to refer to, and I quote here, all the cultures affected by the imperial process from the moment of colonization to the present day. And this is from a book called The Empire Writes Back, published in 1989. The 80s through the early 2000s are really kind of the heyday of post-colonial theory. So post-colonial doesn't just refer to the society after the colonizers have left, right? Post-colonial refers to the way the society is changed and shaped from the moment the colonizers arrive. Practically, for our purposes, what we're really talking about is the study of the literature and culture of South Asia, Africa, the West Indies, Australia, and Canadian First Nations, right? That's usually what post-colonial literary critics are examining. Though it can also refer to, as we'll discuss when we talk about Edward Said, the submerged presence of colonized peoples in canonical European texts. All right, so the term post-colonialism refers to the way former colonies are perceived both by outsiders and by their own citizens, right? So this is a kind of globalizing perspective. And part of the theory is the idea that post-colonial societies will always contain some degree of hybridity, right? You can't erase the colonial influence from the newly independent nation, especially as nations are formed, new nations are formed based on what the colonial borders were rather than what traditional borders were, right? So if, for example, you look at a modern nation like Nigeria, as it's currently constituted, is simply the British part of that region of West Africa, right? The land that was controlled by Britain. That's what's determined the contemporary borders of Nigeria. Within that within that border are several different nations. You have an Igbo nation, a Yoruba nation, a Hausa nation, right? So there are several different ethnic groups who had their own governments and their own cultural practices and who didn't necessarily get along with each other, who are all now subsumed into this new entity. And the thing that unites them is that they have been subject to colonization by Britain, and to some extent their cultural development since the 19th century has been shaped by British influence. So what postcolonial theorists study is the effects of that lingering influence of the colonial power on former colonies. And we see that we've already looked at several kind of foundational theoretical modalities, right? And the ones that are kind of most influential in the formation of postcolonial studies are psychoanalysis, Marxism, and deconstruction, right? Really kind of the same theoretical modes that tend to influence various other late 20th century critical modes that are kind of based on some level advocating for the rights of a particular minority. So there are cultural movements that emerge in the mid 20th century that push back against colonial influence, and that then do also influence post-colonial theory as it comes to be formulated in the late 70s. One of these is an artistic practice known as negritude, or translated from French, blackness. This is a political and artistic movement that is influenced by modernism that dates to the early 1930s. It's launched by African students studying in Paris. And what writers in this movement did, writers and artists in this movement, did was they reasserted traditional African values in opposition, direct opposition to French colonial policy, which was based on assimilation, right? So it was based on a kind of resistance to being assimilated into French culture. And key figures in that movement include the poets Léopold Sédar Senghor from Senegal and Aimé Césaire from Martinique. Though later writers and critics deemed this particular movement insufficient, naive, and even a little foolish. English language writers like Chinua Achebe and Wole Soyinka. Achebe is an Igbo from Nigeria. Soyinka is also Nigerian. He's from the Yoruba tribe. Achebe wrote of this movement that the tiger does not pronounce his tigritude, he pounces, right? So these kinds of declarations of difference are less important, less useful than simple expressions of those kind of older cultural values. Now, another key figure in the development of post-colonial theory is the psychiatrist Frantz Fanon, who attempts to apply Freudian psychoanalysis to the various anti-colonial movements across Africa, the West Indies, and South Asia in the mid-20th century, right? So his best-known book is called The Wretched of the Earth. It's published in 1961. And here's a kind of key quote from that book. So Fanon writes, "We cannot go resolutely forward unless we first realize our alienation. We have taken everything from the other side, yet the other side has given us nothing except to sway us in its direction through 1,000 twists, except lure us, seduce us, and imprison us by 10,000 devices, by 100,000 tricks. To take also means on several levels being taken. It is not enough to try and disengage ourselves by accumulating proclamations and denials. It is not enough to reunite with the people in a past where they no longer exist. We must rather reunite with them in their recent countermove, which will suddenly call everything into question. We must focus on that zone of hidden fluctuation where the people can be found, for let there be no mistake, it is here that their souls are crystallized and their perception and respiration transfigured." Okay, so we can actually see a clear Marxist influence on Fanon's writing here, right? So this concept of ideology that we discussed, when we talked about Marx, right? The ideas of the ruling class that then get kind of filtered down to become everybody's idea of normal, right? That's the process here that Fanon is describing, but he's describing a kind of normal that is imposed on people in colonized nations by a foreign occupying power, right, rather than by local elites. So he's acknowledging here that this has changed the people, that there's no going back to what you were before, but that it is up to the people themselves to decide what they are going to be after, right? Once they have kind of like pushed aside these veils of ideology. Now, another key concept for thinking about post-colonial theory, one that's going to come up quite a bit, is the idea of diaspora. So diaspora comes from the Greek word diasperin. I don't actually understand Greek, so I don't know if that's how you really pronounce it, but there you go. And it's a combination of two words. This is a compound of two different words, right? Dia, over or through, and sparing, to scatter, right? So essentially to scatter over or to scatter through. This was originally a negative or destructive term, right? Diaspora, right? A scattering was something that was done to a people rather than something they chose for themselves, right? Your nation is invaded, people flee, refugees scatter, you have a diaspora. And it originally referred to the dispersal and exile of Jews from the Levant in the wake of Roman conquests and repression. Also to discuss the Jewish presence in Persia. Now, from the 20th century to the present, the term has become kind of broader and more inclusive, and it now refers to any group of people living outside of their ancestral homeland, whether by force or by choice. So you can talk now of, an Irish diaspora, an Iranian diaspora, right? An Igbo diaspora, right? Like basically any place where groups of people from a parent culture have emigrated, right? They're living outside of their ancestral homeland or their kind of native sphere, right? So these are just some of the key figures in contemporary post-colonial criticism, right? As you can see, several of them are still alive. Most of them are born kind of in the 30s through the 50s, right? So this, like I said, this is a mode of criticism that really has its moments from the 80s through the early aughts, right? This is when post-colonial criticism is particularly big, before it starts to encounter very much pushback. And we'll talk a little bit about the pushback at the end of this, because there is actually a good bit of pushback against several of these ideas. So when we talk about post-colonial theory, I think I probably mentioned that Edward Said is really kind of the towering early figure in this movement. So he publishes a book in 1977 called Orientalism. And Orientalism, as Said defines it, is a concept that's heavily influenced by Foucault, by Jacques Lacan, and by Louis Althusser. And Said's definition of it, his brief definition, is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. And we're going to recognize in this Foucault's discourse theory. We're going to recognize Lacan's idea of the symbolic order. We're also probably going to recognize Althusser's notion of interpolation and ideological state apparatuses, right? So Orientalism is, on the one hand, an academic discourse, right? It becomes an academic field towards the end of the 18th century, which means that Western academics begin deciding what constitutes knowledge about the Middle East and South Asia specifically, right? Scholars of Indian and Middle Eastern languages decide what the Orient is and how it should be defined. This is also often used by Western powers like the British East India Company to dominate and control various interests within Asia, right? But it also creates a kind of othering effect, right? Like a lot of it has to do with this kind of setting up a binary between West and East, right? So say, you're looking at this from the perspective of a British merchant working for the East India Company, right? If he sees himself as industrious, he sets the Easterner up as lazy. If he sees himself as chaste, he sets the Easterner up as promiscuous. If he sees himself as honest, then he sets the Easterner up as dishonest, right? So it's about kind of projecting the negative qualities you don't want to see in your own culture onto another culture that you make a kind of subordinate other. So to give you an example of how this sort of thing tended to work in practice, right? So this is a quote from a brief essay by the British historian and politician and businessman Thomas Babington Macaulay from 1835. So Macaulay was a member of the board of directors for the East India Company, right? The primary British means of extracting value from the Indian subcontinent, who also basically ruled most of India up until 1847. And Macaulay is tasked with summarizing the findings of a commission on what language education in India should be conducted in. And they decide on English, right? Surprise, surprise. And this is what he says about it, right? About his decision, right? I have no knowledge of either Sanskrit or Arabic, right? And by Arabic, by the way, he actually means Persian. He doesn't even know what the language is called, right? But I have done what I could to form a correct estimate of their value. I have read translations of the most celebrated Arabic and Sanskrit works. I have conversed both here and at home with men distinguished by their proficiency in the Eastern tongues. I am quite ready to take the Oriental learning at the valuation of the Orientalists themselves. I have never found one among them who could deny that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. The intrinsic superiority of the Western literature is, indeed, fully admitted by those members of the committee who support the Oriental plan of education. So note here when Macaulay says who he consulted in formulating this plan, right? He doesn't consult anyone who actually lives in India, right? He doesn't consult any natives of the place that he purports to be concerned about here. Rather, he consults European academics who study that place and uses what they tell him as a justification for imposing a foreign language on the Indian subcontinent. Now, the other key concept that comes out of Said's work that I'd like y'all to know about is called contrapuntal reading. So the term contrapuntal comes from the musical concept of counterpoint, right? When you've got, kind of two melodies playing alongside each other, right, in a piece of music. one being kind of played underneath the primary melody, right? That's the counterpoint. And as a mode of reading, this is about uncovering a submerged narrative of oppression in canonical texts. So examples of this would be, and they're all over Victorian literature, right? You can find this in Victorian literature all over the place. The story of Rochester's marriage to the West Indian Bertha Mason in Jane Eyre, and the fact that much of his money comes from, her relationship to slave plantation owners in the West Indies, right? She's submerged in the narrative to the fact that she's hidden in an attic. In Jane Austen's novel Mansfield Park, right, the titular house is built and supported with proceeds from Caribbean slave plantations, right? So uncovering these kind of submerged narratives in these novels, this is an example of contrapuntal reading, right? Looking at the ways in which colonialism and slavery are buried in the texts of these novels, right? They're there, they're just not on the surface. They're playing as a kind of counter melody underneath the surface reading. Now, Stuart Hall is one of the most important members of what's called the Birmingham School of Cultural Critics, right? This is a group of thinkers who were connected to the University of Birmingham. The historian Richard Hoggart is another prominent member of this group. They're they are anti-Stalinist leftists, generally in their political orientation. And yeah, they are very much devoted to the study of working class cultures in particular in Britain. Hall himself is Jamaican British, or was, died in 2014. And the concept for which he's best known, and I think one that we need to talk a little bit about in order to understand his essay here, is this kind of binary between encoding and decoding. So essentially what this has to do with the way a message is sent out and the way it's received, right? So when you're encoding a message, right, the sender or producer of a message, right, puts it together using verbal and nonverbal symbols to convey meaning. And those verbal and nonverbal symbols will usually have particular connotations to someone of the senders or the encoders' specific class, cultural, educational, racial, ethnic background, right? Now, decoding occurs when the receiver of a message attempts to comprehend it. And the receiver of the message will decode the message using their own set of cultural competencies, right? So they'll be looking at it through the lens of their own, class identity, racial or ethnic identity, educational background, so on and so forth, right? So the encoder's message will only be decoded exactly as intended by someone from or familiar with the encoder's own cultural norms. So a message is considered successfully sent if the sender's intent is properly decoded by the receiver, which again is probably not going to happen if there is too much difference between the backgrounds of the encoder and the decoder, right? The sender and the receiver. Now, when he talks about, when Hall talks about the kinds of identities that shape practices of encoding and decoding, and this is really what the essay I had you read for today is about, these identities are formed through through processes of enunciation, right? So Hall uses this term to mean generally speaking or writing. So enunciation always takes place in a specific context that includes the speaker's cultural identity and the identity and expectations of their audience. And shared cultural signifiers create a sense of shared identity in diaspora groups, even groups that aren't part of the same diaspora. And one of the things that Hall argues is kind of paradoxical about slavery and colonialism is that by cutting people off from their original cultural roots, British imperialism unexpectedly created a new shared context for a colonial underclass, right? And opportunities for that underclass to unite and work together. Now we're talking here primarily about discourse and about language and about kind of like understanding and encoding and decoding, and this leads us well into Lawrence Venuti's work. Venuti is a translation theorist. I believe he teaches at Temple University in Philadelphia. And he's a big critic of the Anglo-centric empiricist model of translations. There's a quote from Anthony Easthope on page 1203 in the literary theory book that I think y'all should have a look at because it encapsulates what empiricist means in this sense. But basically, an empiricist mode of translation for Venuti is a kind of an attempt at translational neutrality, right? This idea that all you're doing is taking an existing text and putting it into new words that will be comprehensible to speakers of a different language, right? That you're not doing anything else by translating a text. You're not changing the text in any way. You're not interpreting the text in any way. Whereas Venuti argues that translation is always a creative and an interpretive act, right? You are actually creating a new text when you translate by interpreting an existing text. He talks a little bit. He draws on Charles Sanders Peirce, who you might remember from our structuralism discussion as the founder of semiotics. Right? He has this idea of interpretants, right? So interpretants are representations that mediate between a sign and the object that it's supposed to signify. And he identifies two different kinds of interpretants here, right? A formal interpretant is merely a kind of equivalence between words in different languages, right? So this kind of suits that empiricist model of translation. A thematic interpretant, and this is what Venuti's more interested in, takes into account cultural codes, existing discourses, and other already existing translations and interpretations in shaping a new translation, right? Rather than just finding one-to-one correspondences between words, right? You're trying to translate not just a word, but in some ways a set of cultural practices. Again, kind of think back to New Historicism and Clifford Geertz for some of that. Venuti also argues that translation can help us to question the source texts and its assumptions just as much as it can help us to understand and to enjoy it. Okay, so because postcolonial theory is still one of the most hotly contested theoretical modes that is used in the contemporary academy, I do want to discuss a little bit some of the objections to postcolonial theory that arise. And I'm going to do this mostly from the perspective of the political left and the global South, because many of the objections from the political right tend primarily to accuse postcolonial theorists of operating in bad faith, or of there's often a kind of undercurrent of like that postcolonial theorists are simply resentful and trying to foment conflict between groups, right? So I'm going to focus mostly on critiques here from thinkers, writers, philosophers who are more or less sympathetic to a lot of postcolonialism's goals, rather but may question its methods, right? So one of the key figures one of the key questioners of modern postcolonial theory was the Indian American philosopher Ayaz Ahmad, pictured here. He died in 2022. So one objection that is often raised to postcolonial theory, and this is often leveled at theories that are derived from Marxism, psychoanalysis, and deconstruction, is that like a lot of prose written by post-colonial theorists, Homi Bhabha comes in for this criticism in particular a lot, is jargon-laden, it's dense, it is sometimes incomprehensible. There are these kind of like these jargon words no one understands, that are buried in these sentences with clauses piled upon clauses piled upon clauses that are difficult to read. And yes, so this leads some critics to argue that post-colonial theorists aren't really saying anything. They're just throwing a lot of language at you. It can also be reductive. It is sometimes overly reliant on a very simple oppressor versus oppressed binary and doesn't always capture the complexity of the negotiations between oppressor, the so-called the so-called oppressor group and the so-called oppressed group, right? And kind of related to this, it also sometimes assumes that colonized societies lack agency or complexity, that they're simply kind of, it leads to a kind of victim narrative in which the colonized societies have no power over their own destiny. And finally, one key argument against post-colonial theory is that by ignoring specific national contexts or regional traditions, it actually recolonizes literatures from the global South for consumption by European and American audiences, in favor of these kind of globalized narratives, right? Like, applying the same set of criteria everywhere ignores particularly interesting and useful regional differences. All right, so we're going to wrap it up there. I will post an announcement probably on Tuesday morning, the 22nd, regarding what I want you all to do with the discussion boards. And I will also tomorrow morning reopen the quizzes and the critique assignment, as I said it would at the beginning of this lecture. Okay, so I will see you next week or on the discussion boards. Hopefully on the discussion boards this time. Yes, yes. All right. And take care, everyone.